I didn't fail. I was quietly undone by the people who said they believed in me. They celebrated my rise. Then rewrote the story when I no longer needed them. Welcome to Brinicle Reads. This is not a story about revenge. This is a story about betrayal, awakening, and the calm power of rebuilding in silence. The rise. I didn't start out believing I was meant for anything extraordinary. I learned early how to be careful with hope. How to want things quietly. How to keep my expectations low enough that disappointment wouldn't hurt as much when it arrived. Confidence, for me, wasn't natural. It was something I practiced in private, like a skill I didn't want anyone to know I was still learning. I came from nothing dramatic. No tragic headline. No single moment that explained my caution. Just years of being overlooked, underestimated, and occasionally reminded, subtly, consistently, that I wasn't the obvious choice. So I learned how to work in silence. I watched more than I spoke. I listened more than I asked. I noticed patterns others ignored. While people chased recognition, I chased competence. While others announced their dreams, I kept mine folded neatly inside me, afraid that speaking them aloud might make them disappear. Progress came slowly. Painfully. In increments so small they were almost invisible. A skill sharpened after midnight. A risk taken quietly. A fear faced without witnesses. I failed more times than I succeeded, but no one saw those moments. They happened in empty rooms, in quiet hours, in the spaces where doubt was loud and encouragement non-existent. Still, something kept me going. Not confidence, commitment. I showed up even when I didn't feel ready. Especially when I didn't feel ready. And then, gradually, things began to change. People started noticing. At first, it was small. A compliment that lingered longer than politeness required. A nod of approval that felt genuine. Someone saying, "You're actually really good at this," like they'd just discovered it themselves. I didn't trust it. Praise had always felt conditional to me, something given easily and taken away faster. So when encouragement came, I accepted it carefully, like something fragile. I smiled. I said thank you. I didn't lean on it. But it kept coming. More responsibility. More visibility. More trust. The things I'd worked for quietly were suddenly being acknowledged publicly. And with that acknowledgement came people. They gathered around me slowly, naturally. Friends who offered advice. Coworkers who championed my ideas. A partner who looked at me like they saw potential I hadn't fully claimed yet. They cheered when I succeeded. They reassured me when I hesitated. They spoke about us, about growing together, about loyalty and shared futures. For the first time in a long time, I felt something unfamiliar. Safety. Not the kind that comes from certainty, but the kind that comes from believing you're not alone. From thinking that if you stumbled, someone would reach for you instead of stepping over you. They made space for me. Or so it felt. They told me I deserved what I was building. That my past didn't define me. That I'd earned my place. When old fears resurfaced, when I worried that this was temporary, that I'd somehow lose it all, they dismissed those fears gently. You're overthinking. You belong here. We've got you. Those words mattered more than I admitted. They softened parts of me that had been rigid for survival. They convinced me to trust again, first in small ways, then bigger ones. I shared ideas earlier than I would have. I asked for feedback. I believed collaboration would protect me. I let them see my ambition. That was new. Before them, my dreams had been private, something I nurtured alone. With them, dreaming felt communal. Like success wasn't a competition but a shared destination. We celebrated milestones together. Spoke about the future as if it were already promised. And I grew. Not just in achievement, but in confidence. I stood taller. Spoke more clearly. Took up space without apologizing for it. I wasn't loud, but I was present. I wasn't perfect, but I was improving. And people noticed that too. That's when things subtly shifted. Not enough to alarm me. Just enough to register somewhere deep, where intuition lives. A joke that felt a little too sharp. A compliment that carried a pause. A moment where support felt measured. I ignored it. Because why wouldn't I? These were the people who had believed in me when I still doubted myself. The ones who had clapped when I won. The ones who had stood beside me as I rose. I told myself not to be suspicious. Not to project past wounds onto present relationships. Not to ruin something good by being afraid. So I trusted them fully. I shared my plans. My strategies. My ideas for what came next. I spoke openly about my goals, believing transparency built loyalty. They listened. They smiled. They encouraged me. And quietly, silently, something else began forming beneath the surface. I couldn't see it yet. I was too busy becoming the version of myself they said they supported. By the time I reached what felt like my highest point so far, confidence steady, skills sharp, momentum undeniable, I believed, genuinely, that I had finally found my place. I thought the rise was proof that I was safe. I didn't know yet that this was the moment everything would begin to unravel. The betrayal. Betrayal rarely announces itself. It doesn't slam doors or raise its voice. It doesn't look like an enemy walking straight toward you. Most of the time, it looks like familiarity. Like people you trust continuing to smile while slowly changing the rules. The first signs were so small I almost dismissed them out of habit. A meeting I wasn't invited to. A decision made without my input. A credit line missing my name. Nothing dramatic. Nothing undeniable. Just enough to feel off. I told myself I was imagining things. That success had made me hyper-aware. That not everything was about me. I didn't want to become suspicious of the very people who had supported me. That kind of thinking felt ungrateful. Paranoid. So I adjusted. I worked harder. I double-checked my contributions. I made myself more available, more helpful, more accommodating. I wanted to remove any doubt, both theirs and mine. They thanked me. They praised my dedication. They reassured me. And then they kept doing it. The subtle exclusions. The quiet shifts. The unspoken distance. It was never direct enough to confront. Never clear enough to accuse. Every time I considered speaking up, I heard their voices in my head before they ever said the words out loud. You're reading too much into it. Don't be so sensitive. You know how things work. Sensitive. That word has a way of shrinking you. It makes you doubt your instincts. Makes you second-guess the patterns you're clearly seeing. Makes you afraid that if you push back, you'll be labeled difficult instead of discerning. So I stayed quiet. I watched. And what I saw, slowly, painfully, was a version of reality being rewritten without me. Ideas I had shared privately resurfaced publicly, spoken in someone else's voice. Strategies I had outlined were praised when they came from different mouths. My work became invisible unless someone else stood beside it to validate it. When I noticed, they softened it. Oh, it was a group effort. We're all contributing here. Don't worry about titles. But recognition isn't about ego. It's about truth. And the truth was being edited. Behind closed doors, conversations were happening that I wasn't part of. Narratives were forming in rooms I never entered. Doubts were being planted carefully, never as accusations, always as concern. I'm just worried about her stress levels. She's great, but maybe she's not ready for that yet. She's changed a little, don't you think? Concern is the most respectable disguise for sabotage. By the time it reaches you, it already sounds reasonable. I felt it in the way people looked at me differently. In the hesitation before they responded. In the way trust thinned without explanation. And still, they smiled. They asked how I was doing. They checked in. They told me they believed in me. They said they had my back. That's what made it unbearable. If they had attacked me openly, I could have fought back. If they had criticized me publicly, I could have defended myself. But they didn't do that. They let me doubt myself instead. They let the confusion do the damage. I tried to clarify things. Carefully. Gently. I asked questions without accusation. I wanted to understand what had changed. Their answers were polished. We're just restructuring. Things evolve. You'll understand later. Later never came. What came instead was erosion. My influence shrank. My voice softened again. My confidence, once steady, began cracking under the weight of uncertainty. I found myself rehearsing conversations before having them, editing my words mid-sentence, questioning whether my instincts were still reliable. Gaslighting doesn't always come from one person. Sometimes it comes from a system. From enough people subtly disagreeing with your reality that you begin to doubt it yourself. I watched as opportunities one had earned were handed to others. Watched my reputation blur into something I didn't recognize. Watched people I had supported distance themselves, not aggressively, just enough to be safe. Safety is contagious. People follow whatever feels least risky. And questioning the narrative they were being fed about me felt risky. So they stayed quiet too. I became careful with my emotions. Careful with my expressions. Careful not to seem defensive or emotional or difficult. I didn't want to give anyone more reason to doubt me. But the more careful I became, the smaller I felt. The betrayal was never loud. It was methodical. They didn't push me out. They made me step back on my own. They watched me struggle and called it growth. They watched me bend and called it resilience. And when I began to pull inward, when my energy shifted from expansion to survival, they used that too. She's not as engaged lately. She seems different. She's lost some of that spark. They took what they caused and blamed me for it. That's when something inside me began to break. Not dramatically. Quietly. I stopped sharing ideas. Stopped trusting encouragement. Stopped believing praise was real. Every compliment sounded strategic. Every smile felt measured. I started scanning faces for signs of insincerity, replaying conversations long after they ended, searching for what I might have missed. Sleep became shallow. My thoughts refused to rest. At night, the truth circled me like a question without an answer. Was I wrong? Had I misunderstood everything? Or had I trusted the wrong people? The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing that the people who built me up had learned exactly how to dismantle me, because I had shown them how. They knew my fears. They knew my hopes. They knew where I doubted myself. And they used that knowledge with precision. By the time I understood what was happening, my foundation was already compromised. The trust one had placed in them had become leverage. They didn't need to push harder. Gravity was already doing the work. The fall. The fall didn't come all at once. There was no dramatic moment. No confrontation. No explosion that marked the end of what I had built. Instead, it happened the way most real collapses do, slowly, silently, in pieces small enough to ignore until they became impossible to escape. At first, it felt like distance. People who once met my eyes now looked past me. Conversations softened when I entered the room, then resumed with careful neutrality. My presence no longer changed the energy, it muted it. I told myself this was normal. That relationships evolve. That success reshuffles dynamics. But deep down, I felt something colder than change. I felt removal. I was still there, but no longer included. Meetings happened without me. Decisions were announced instead of discussed. My role shifted from contributor to observer without anyone saying it out loud. When I asked questions, the answers were polite and shallow. You didn't miss much. It was just logistics. We'll loop you in next time. Next time rarely came. I began to feel like a guest in a place I had helped build. Publicly, I smiled. I kept my tone light. I didn't want to confirm whatever quiet doubts had begun circulating about me. I thought if I stayed calm, stayed agreeable, stayed useful, things might correct themselves. Instead, I faded. The more invisible I became, the more uncertain I felt. And uncertainty is corrosive. It eats at your sense of reality until even your own thoughts feel unreliable. I replayed conversations obsessively. Looked for moments where I might have misstepped. Where I could have been clearer, stronger, less trusting. Every interaction became evidence in a trial where I was both judge and defendant. Was I too ambitious? Too quiet? Too confident? Not confident enough? The questions never ended. At night, the silence was unbearable. Without distractions, everything surfaced. The doubt. The fear. The quiet panic that maybe they were right to pull away. Maybe I wasn't as capable as I thought. Maybe I had misread my own rise. Imposter syndrome isn't a lack of confidence. It's a loss of belonging. And I no longer felt like I belonged anywhere. I started withdrawing, not out of bitterness, but exhaustion. I didn't have the energy to perform certainty when I felt so fractured inside. I spoke less in group settings. I chose words carefully, afraid that anything I said might be used against me. That caution was noticed. Not with concern, but with judgment. She's not as engaged anymore. She seems unsure of herself. She's changed. They spoke about my reaction as if it were the cause. And slowly, that narrative became public. People began treating me like a question mark. Like a risk. Like someone who had lost momentum. Invitations stopped altogether. Support became conditional. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was being overlooked. Being replaced. Being spoken about instead of spoken to. It was watching others step into spaces I once occupied while pretending not to notice. It was being reduced. And worst of all, it was internal. I began to believe it. I questioned my worth in ways I never had before. Not just my work, but my instincts. My perceptions. My right to take up space at all. I wondered if I had imagined the rise. If the confidence I felt was misplaced. If the trust one had been given was temporary, on loan, not earned. Shame has a way of turning inward. Of convincing you that everything falling apart is proof of something defective inside you. I stopped celebrating small wins. Stopped acknowledging progress. Everything felt tainted. Every success came with the suspicion that it could be taken away just as easily. Sleep became fragmented. My body rested, but my mind stayed alert, scanning, analyzing, bracing for the next loss. Mornings arrived heavy. Nights stretched endlessly. I felt watched and unseen at the same time. There were moments when I considered leaving altogether. Starting over somewhere no one knew me. Somewhere my reputation hadn't been quietly rewritten. But even that felt like failure. So I stayed. And staying cost me. I became smaller. Quieter. More hesitant. The woman who had once spoken with clarity now filtered every thought through fear. Fear of being misinterpreted. Fear of being dismissed. Fear of confirming the story being told about me. I didn't cry publicly. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand answers. I collapsed privately. In bathrooms. In parked cars. In the spaces between obligations. No one noticed, or if they did, they didn't intervene. Isolation doesn't mean being alone. It means being surrounded by people who choose not to reach for you. At my lowest point, I wondered if I was losing my grip on reality. If my feelings were exaggerations. If I was too emotional. Too sensitive. Too much. Those words, once whispered, had taken root. And then, one night, something changed. Not externally. Internally. I was sitting alone, exhausted from explaining myself to no one, when a thought surfaced, clear and steady. What if I wasn't broken? What if this wasn't collapse, but exposure? The idea frightened me. Because if I wasn't the problem, then the truth was something else entirely. The awakening. The awakening didn't arrive like a revelation. There was no dramatic realization, no rush of anger, no sudden clarity that made everything feel resolved. It came quietly, the way truth often does, when exhaustion finally silences denial. I was tired. Not just physically, but emotionally tired of questioning myself. Tired of replaying conversations that no longer existed. Tired of trying to prove something to people who had already decided who I was. One morning, after another night of shallow sleep, I noticed something different. The anxiety was still there, but the panic wasn't. Instead of bracing myself for the day, I felt detached from it. Observant. Like I was standing slightly outside my own experience, watching things unfold without needing to intervene. That distance gave me clarity. For the first time, I stopped asking, what did I do wrong? And asked a different question. What if nothing is wrong with me at all? The thought unsettled me. Because if that were true, then everything I had been internalizing, every doubt, every shame spiral, every apology I never owed, had been misplaced. I began reviewing the past months not emotionally, but structurally. Patterns emerged. The support that vanished the moment I stopped being useful. The encouragement that came only when I stayed within certain limits. The sudden concern when my growth became visible. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was containment. They hadn't turned against me because I failed. They had turned because I succeeded independently of them. And that realization cracked something open inside me. I saw how carefully the environment had been shaped. How the doubt wasn't accidental, it was cultivated. How the narrative about me had been curated slowly, softly, so no one person could be blamed. This wasn't chaos. It was control. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The shame that had lived inside me began to loosen its grip. Not because I felt empowered yet, but because shame requires belief to survive. And I no longer believed the story being told about me. I stopped explaining myself. That was the first boundary. Not announced. Not defended. Just enacted. I answered questions plainly. I shared less. I reacted slower. When someone hinted at doubt or concern, I didn't rush to reassure them anymore. I let silence do the work. It made people uncomfortable. They were used to my availability, my openness, my willingness to clarify, to fix, to soften. Without that, they had nothing to push against. And slowly, the power dynamic shifted. I began to see how often I had overextended myself emotionally. How often I had carried conversations, repaired tension, absorbed blame just to keep things smooth. Peace, I realized, had cost me my voice. So I recalibrated. I learned that boundaries don't require justification. That clarity doesn't need consensus. That self-respect is not something you negotiate. I didn't confront anyone. There was no satisfaction in that. Confrontation would have required me to convince them of something they already knew. And I was done performing for their understanding. Instead, I withdrew strategically. I stopped sharing plans. Stopped offering ideas prematurely. Stopped making myself emotionally accessible to people who benefited from my vulnerability. Not out of bitterness. Out of awareness. And something unexpected happened. The more I detached, the clearer others became. The supportive ones leaned in gently, without agenda. The opportunistic ones grew impatient. The manipulators revealed themselves in frustration. People showed me who they were when I stopped playing my role. That was the true awakening. I wasn't broken, I had been overly open in a closed system. I hadn't failed, I had outgrown a structure that depended on my doubt. The strength that emerged wasn't loud. It didn't look like dominance or defiance. It looked like steadiness. I spoke less, but when I did, I meant it. I listened more, but trusted myself again. I stopped asking for permission to exist in my own space. There were moments when guilt surfaced. When the old instinct to explain and soften returned. But I learned to sit with that discomfort. Guilt, I realized, is what shows up when you stop abandoning yourself. And I refused to abandon myself again. This phase wasn't glamorous. No one applauded it. From the outside, it probably looked like withdrawal. Like disengagement. Like someone fading further. But internally, something was solidifying. My sense of identity no longer depended on their validation. I didn't need to be seen to know who I was. And that was dangerous, to the people who had relied on my visibility. I began rebuilding my inner framework quietly. Relearning what I valued. What I tolerated. What I no longer accepted. Trust became selective. Energy became protected. Time became intentional. I stopped trying to be understood by those who never intended to understand me. And in that space, peace returned, not the fragile kind, but the grounded kind. The kind that doesn't need constant reassurance to survive. I didn't feel victorious. I felt awake. The comeback. The comeback didn't look like triumph. There were no public declarations, no dramatic exits, no moment where I finally proved them wrong. If anything, it looked ordinary. Quiet. Almost forgettable. That was the point. I rebuilt myself in a space where no one was watching closely anymore. In the absence of attention, I found freedom. There were no expectations to meet, no narratives to fight against. Just me, my work, and the discipline I had once mistaken for desperation. The days became structured again, not around validation, but around intention. I woke up early, not to get ahead of anyone, but to meet myself before the world demanded anything from me. I worked steadily. Carefully. With clarity. Every action had a reason now. Every decision passed through a filter I hadn't used before. Does this align with who I am becoming? If the answer was no, I let it go. I stopped reacting to the past. Stopped checking for signs of recognition. Stopped wondering who was watching. That curiosity had cost me too much already. Instead, I invested in mastery. I refined skills they never bothered to understand. I deepened knowledge they once dismissed. I built systems that didn't depend on approval or consensus. My confidence returned, not as hope, but as certainty earned in solitude. It was lonely at first. There's a particular quiet that comes with choosing yourself after being undone. The applause disappears. The noise fades. You realize how many people were only present for the performance, not the person. But loneliness, I learned, isn't always absence. Sometimes it's protection. I learned to sit with myself without distraction. To let silence sharpen me instead of scaring me. To move forward without narrating every step. Strength began to show up in unexpected ways. I stopped oversharing. Stopped explaining. Stopped volunteering emotional labor where it wasn't reciprocated. My boundaries became firm, not rigid. Clear, not defensive. And slowly, momentum returned. Not the chaotic kind that demands attention, but the steady kind that compounds. The kind you don't notice until suddenly it's undeniable. Opportunities began to surface, not because I chased them, but because my work spoke when I didn't. People started seeking my perspective again. My reputation stabilized, not through defense, but through consistency. The version of me they once controlled no longer existed. I didn't announce the change. I embodied it. And that's when they noticed. Not all at once. In fragments. A glance held a second longer. A conversation shifted in tone. An attempt at reconnection disguised as curiosity. How have you been? You seem different. We should catch up sometime. I answered politely. Calmly. Briefly. No resentment. No explanations. They felt the difference immediately. I wasn't available the way I used to be. My energy no longer bent to accommodate. I didn't rush to fill silences or repair discomfort. I didn't seek their approval, or fear their opinion. I had become unreachable. Not emotionally cold, but internally anchored. They sensed it. People who once minimized me now hesitated. People who once spoke for me now waited. The power dynamic had shifted without confrontation. And that unsettled them more than anger ever could. Because they couldn't argue with my growth. They couldn't dismiss it. They couldn't claim it. They couldn't control it. The realization arrived quietly for them, too. They had lost access. Not just to my work, but to my trust. My vulnerability. My willingness to explain myself. And there was no way back. I didn't need closure from them. Closure came the moment I realized I didn't want their recognition anymore. I had outgrown the environment that needed me small. The final moment wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation. No final scene where they apologized or admitted what they'd done. That kind of ending exists only in imagination. Reality was subtler. One day, I saw it in their eyes. Recognition. Not admiration. Not remorse. Loss. They understood, too late, that the woman they had underestimated had rebuilt herself without them. That the support they once pretended to offer was never the reason I succeeded. I was. And I walked away, not physically, but internally, without needing to be seen doing it. No revenge. No theatrics. Just peace. Because the strongest power isn't proving someone wrong. It's no longer needing them to understand you at all. That's it. If this story felt familiar, remember this. Sometimes the strongest comeback is simply becoming unreachable. This is Brinicle Reads. And some victories are meant to be quiet.